Hi, welcome to another video of Geospinach. Today we're going to talk about the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, only the military aspect of it, and we're going to talk about why is the front line not moving, did Ukraine actually launch its counteroffensive and how is it going, did the Russians really launch a counteroffensive at March, what is really happening on the front line. Now, before answering those things, let's get to understand a few concepts. Currently, we have very few access to information of what is really happening on the front lines. We do not really know what's happening in reality there, and we will know for at least a couple of years. Now, war is complex, and the news media has been quite misleading with various reports such as the Ukrainian army has lost half of these unique Leopard tanks, and I've read news saying that the Leopard tanks are really bad tanks. No, they are not. They are brilliant tanks. But anything untanking entrenched positions will most likely result to destruction. In this video, we're going to analyze exactly these specific points with a militaristic, scientific approach to it. So we're not going to look at the Ukrainian front line, but understand the concepts of why the front line is not moving. Or you see reports, for example, that a former army ranger who fought in Ukraine says conflict there is far worse than fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. No shit! The war is Ukraine is an actual war. It's not an operational war. You don't go fight for 1-2 days and then go back to your camp. No. It's an actual war. And in actual wars, after the first initial stages have commenced, after both sides have taken massive casualties, and both sides have dug down and they have built entrenchment positions across the front line, it means then that it's really hard to penetrate the front line. Now, personally, as a military analyst, I will argue that Ukraine shouldn't have launched its counteroffensive. The idea is that Ukraine should have kept its newly acquired forces from the West as a reserve, keep its older forces that it had on the front line, and wait the summer out. It has nothing to gain from a counterattacking. And if they do let the Russians actually attack, and the Russians do attack, and they do manage to breach their front lines, then Ukraine can easily counterattack with those new fresh troops and encounter the Russian armor in open terrain with their Leopard tanks and their AMX tanks and under their umbrella of anti-aircraft as well as their air power and be able to decimate the Russians. But due to political pressure from the West, they decide to attack. Why don't we see the front line moving? Now, what we truly see in the front line is actually proking offensives. So what we saw is that you use your current front line infantry units attacking across the front line because you know the enemy is entrenched, and the map here shows you the very deep defensive system that the Russians have built. This is very common in war, for example, like the Battle of Kursk. And the purpose of proking attack is that once you figure out that there is a weakness, then you throw in your big forces to that point to strike in. Now, this has quite a lot of issues. That even if you manage to break through a deep defense line system, which is very unlikely, what you will manage to do is snake through the enemy's defenses. Your armor will have suffered a lot of casualties. You will go above your anti-aircraft umbrella, and as a result, you are massively exposed to the air power of the enemy, predefined defensive positions, and thus your force can easily be annihilated, thus not being able to be exploited. Now, that will be the case if Russia performs the bare minimum that it's supposed to perform. The thing is, we just don't know what is truly happening in the war. Now, I made a video previously about the Russian-Ukrainian war. I did make some assumptions back then. Those assumptions were wrong. Didn't expect the Russians to underperform so massively. Now, let's do some general understanding of what's happening in the front line. The Russians have around 300,000 to 500,000 troops. We don't know specifically. The Ukrainians probably have a bit fewer, but we still don't know. So from 200k to around 300k, we still don't know maybe the numbers are much bigger. So both divisions on both sides have suffered a lot of damage, so a lot of units are not full strength, and if a unit is not full strength, it might be able to go on the defensive, but going on the offensive, it's very, very hard to achieve, especially if you are battle awareness. The fatigue has taken a lot of toll. Now, how offensive works on entrenchment in open fields. Now, I'm going to show you an example where you're going to have infantry, an infantry brigade, like in the military scenario I have here, that's generally exposed, so it's not expecting a massive attack, getting attacked by a lot of units, reinforced infantry brigades, as well as a lot of armor brigades and mechanized brigades. What happens in these scenarios? Now, I'm going to make a more dedicated video on this. I'm going to go really, really fast on these scenarios. What really happens on this is that you don't have your troops pre-planned in any position. The enemy armor pushes in while the infantry pins you down, and the concept of pinning you down is very, very important. It means it doesn't allow the infantry to retreat. As a result, the armor pushes in. Once the armor has pushed in, the objective of the armor is to complete the encirclement while your infantry continues pushing down and the last reserves. And the idea is to push the enemy as fast as possible and thus continue your offensive where you originally planned to do, as you see in the video I planned, to achieve your general encirclement. Now, this is the scenario that happens in theory at the start of wars. What we currently see in Ukraine is something very, very different. We see a deep defensive system. Now, we assume that the Ukrainians and the Russians are both using the Russian School of War. We've seen neither of them use it, and we've seen both of them use it. At this point, it's quite confusing. But according to Tukhachevsky and later Zhukov, the main concept of the deep battle tactics is that you use a lot of artillery, hit across the front line with infantry, concentrate your best infantry at few positions with a bit more firepower, and the moment they start breaching the enemy defenses a bit, then you throw in your armor and go to the exploitation phase. Now, to achieve that exploitation phase, you actually need some sort of air superiority. Now, here I'm going to show you an example of how a deep defense system works, what Russia currently has. Here we have a scenario where the black team has way more forces at this specific front line than the red team, but of course the longer the red team delays the black team, the more reinforcements will eventually come. Now, we're going to go through this battle really, really fast. I'm going to make more a dedicated video on this, specifically analyzing deep defense systems and deep battle defense systems. Now, the black team launches this offensive, pushes through in, but starts to get stalled. And this is what we see in Ukraine. Ukrainian troops getting a bit of ground and then gradually getting stalled a bit. They push in as much as they can. They start getting more and more casualties while being pinned down. Then defendants have already put in anti-tank defenses, mines, booby-trapped everything, have pre-assigned artillery positions, pre-assigned anti-tank positions. That means that you have your sights of your artillery piece or anti-tank missile or piece at one specific area where you know that the enemy is coming there, and then when it does, you inflict a lot of damage on it. And we see as this battle envelops, which is an example here, like while the black team is gaining more and more ground, is what we see currently in Ukraine. If the more they continue using their armor units to break through predefined defensive positions, what they do manage to achieve is come to a point where their armor is so heavily damaged that even if reinforcements didn't come in prior, for the red team in this case, and they did manage to encircle the city, and they did manage to capture the city, the amount of forces they will have remained to continue their assault will be so minimal, which capturing the city for such a huge loss of life makes the whole operation quite meaningless, especially when you try to use armor. And in this scenario, I show exactly this, the wrong concept of reinforcing failure. That's why you never really attack a deep defense system in this manner without using pre-assigned artillery and piecemeal destroy the enemy's defenses. So you concentrate your infantry, you take a few positions, you reassign your artillery pieces, you scout the position again and again and again and again. Yes, it resembles World War I, but this is the way you do it. The only way to move to a more mobile warfare is to start pushing in those deep defensive systems longer and longer and longer, exhausting the defendant to the point that their morale kind of collapses, and then you patch in with your armor. At least that's how the Russian School of War works. Now, if the Ukrainians could have used a German School of War and do a more lighting attack, blitzkrieg attack as they say, there are other means where you can overcome deep defense systems plannings, but if an army has not been trained to do it, and trained by the West is not blitzkrieg, it's kind of impossible to start from zero. Now, why has Russia generally failed in its offensive in March? Now, the question is a bit wrong in this sense that we don't really know if Russia actually launched an offensive in March. It did capture Bakhmut with quite a lot of forces, and mainly Wagner groups, but as you saw in Bakhmut was mainly with infantry, artillery, piece by piece breaking down the defenses and acquiring a good position. We haven't seen a mass assault across the front line. Now, this might be because the Russian high command is missing all of the supplies and all of their units are very bad, or maybe they are expecting a Ukrainian counterattack, and then once they manage to deplete the Ukrainian resources, then they will launch a counterattack on the Ukrainian counterattack and pushing through in. This is a scenario we've seen countless of times. The best resemblance of a scenario such as this is the Battle of Kursk, where the German army used its armor to push in the deep defensive line that Zhukov had prepared. They suffered severe casualties, so when the general offensive of the Russian army began, the Germans had very few forces available on reserve to stop them, and their pre-existing armor was practically completely annihilated. Now, in regards to Ukraine counteroffensive, is Ukraine likely going to capture significant land? The clear answer, well, we do not know. I'm assuming the stalemate will continue. I'm assuming they might gain a bit of ground. If ceteris paribus, so everything remains the same, Ukraine might be able to capture just a bit of land there and there and there, but they won't be able to move further. So if in theory they will be able to move further, I'm assuming the Russians already have reserves of armor across their deep defensive system line. So that's the whole concept of a deep defensive system line. They also have heavy air superiority above their own area, while the Ukrainians have their umbrellas protecting their current front lines, but they does not cover the front lines above Ukraine. As a result, if the Ukrainians do manage to push through, if the Russians act as they're supposed to do according to their School of War, they will counterattack almost immediately, and thus eliminating those Ukrainian forces. Now, in a general conclusion, firstly, one point that I heard quite a lot. No, Western tanks are really good, especially the Leopard tank. But the Leopard tank is not able to destroy any good entrenchment positions better than any other tank. The Leopard tank is a brilliant tank when it comes to open terrain and under very well-trained troops, and that circumstance doesn't always occur, or actually it's very hard to occur. So, in a conclusion, the war will most likely remain a stalemate, the casualties will continue to rise and rise and rise, and Ukraine probably shouldn't have launched this counteroffensive, except if they know something we do not know as military analysts. And what we see here in the mounting casualties is not actually the main force of the counterattack, but is still the proking phase, and they are still testing the Russian defenses, and that they are still willing to take quite a lot of casualties, and they have way more reinforcements on the back to use for the exploitation phase. If that's not the case, then the whole point of using a counteroffensive as a political tool is as retarded as Putin ordering the attack on Kiev. Thank you for watching. This has been an update on the Russian-Ukrainian war. I will make a video on the geopolitics of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. My specialty is Russia and Germany, but Russia specifically in the sense that I've studied their history, their culture, and so forth, except their military part. I'm neither pro-Russian nor pro-Ukrainian, but I am in favor in the concept that this war does not have an end that the West believes that it has. For me, this Ukrainian conflict is no different than the conflict we have here in Cyprus, which it will result in some occupied area and the West kind of completely forgetting that that ever happened. The same thing that happened with Nagorno-Karabakh in Armenia and Azerbaijan, with Kosovo in Serbia. This time, the one that got attacked was supported by the US. I am in favor of Ukraine at this point to use the fear of a counterattack as a tool for negotiations to be able to achieve and recapture as much of its land as possible through political means. And I'm saying that as an individual from a country that has lost 39%, 37% of its land from the Turkish invasion of 1974, and we're so patriotic back then that they gave us so many solutions that we declined, coming to a point that we just lost half our country. Now, if Ukraine wants this path, where the West is pushing it towards this path, then they can continue pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. Again, my message is not pro-Russian here. Russia is on the wrong here. There is no debate around it. The main argument is that Russia will not stop. Russia cannot stop. The only way that Russia can stop is if it falls into a massive civil war, or if the government collapses, and if that happens, the vengeance behind it will never subside. And the balance of power in Europe in general will be overruled. You're just going to push Russia completely to the Chinese camp. So I will agree with what Macron tried to do in the early stages of the conflict to try to mitigate some sort of an agreement. But anyway, that it's going for a later video. Please like and subscribe, and I'm going to release a bit more videos in regards specifically to deep battle operations and deep defensive system operations, as well as geopolitical analysis of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. I also have some long videos on the conflict. You can ignore the assumptions and the predictions I made in those videos and focus more on the historiography of the conflict and the geopolitics that I argued in those videos. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and see you next time.